Jesus revealed to the chosen how to see the invisible watchers. This is what they fear most. Opens by establishing that what humanity calls reality has always been a narrowed version of something far larger. The narrative explains that Jesus did not come merely to offer moral guidance or spiritual comfort, but to restore an ancient human capacity that had been deliberately buried. According to preserved fragments and suppressed traditions, he spoke to the chosen not as mystics seeking visions, but as sober observers of the material world. He warned that control does not require chains or armies, it only requires invisibility. The Watchers, described as overseers operating just beyond ordinary perception, maintain influence precisely because they are unseen. Their strength lies not in power, but in anonymity. The chapter emphasizes that the human eye was never broken, only conditioned. From childhood, people are trained to focus narrowly, to trust only what fits consensus, and to dismiss anomalies as imagination. Jesus, however, taught that the eye is not merely an organ of sight, but a gatekeeper of awareness. When perception is constrained, influence becomes effortless. The chosen were instructed to question not beliefs, but perception itself. The chapter closes by asserting that once something hidden becomes visible, it loses authority instantly, which is why this teaching could never be allowed to spread. Deepens the idea by explaining how vision itself became a prison. The story describes how human perception was engineered to register only a thin slice of reality, enough to function, but not enough to understand. This limitation created a predictable, controllable species. The Watchers exploit this narrow bandwidth, existing just outside accepted visual range, while remaining close enough to influence emotion, thought, and behavior. The chapter reframes fear, anxiety, and intrusive impulses, not as moral failures, but as symptoms of unseen interference. Jesus' teaching challenged this system at its root by revealing that perception is not fixed. The brain filters far more than it reveals, deleting what does not match expectation. The chosen were taught that this filter is learned, not permanent. The more consistently something is noticed, the weaker the filter becomes. The chapter ends by reminding the viewer that nothing is more dangerous to a hidden system than sustained observation. The forgotten discipline of seeing expands the teaching by clarifying that Jesus never instructed the chosen to withdraw from daily life in order to perceive what was hidden. On the contrary, the method depended on remaining fully awake, grounded, and present in ordinary reality. Altered states were considered unreliable because they could be dismissed, misinterpreted, or confined to personal experience. What threatened the system was perception that functioned while walking, working, and interacting with the world. The narrative explains that human attention had been trained over generations to become sharp, narrow, and aggressive, always locking onto objects, labels, and meanings. This form of attention strengthens the mental filter that deletes what does not conform. Jesus taught the opposite approach, a relaxed, receptive awareness that does not hunt for meaning, but allows the entire visual field to exist at once. This discipline required patience, because the mind resists uncertainty and constantly seeks focus. Peripheral awareness played a central role, not as a mystical concept, but as a biological function that modern humans rarely trust. Peripheral vision detects movement, depth, and subtle changes long before conscious interpretation intervenes. The narrative emphasizes that the first signs are never dramatic. They appear as inconsistencies, shifts in shadow, distortions that feel out of place but lack form. The conditioned mind immediately tries to explain them away. The chosen were taught to resist that impulse and simply observe without naming. Over time, repetition weakens the brain's automatic deletion process. What was once classified as visual noise begins to register as pattern. This process is described as retraining rather than awakening, because nothing new is added. The eye already receives the data, only interpretation changes. The chapter stresses that this discipline was dangerous to centralized authority because it could not be regulated. It required no temple, no intermediary, no permission. Anyone willing to practice disciplined observation could reclaim it. That simplicity made suppression necessary. When the unseen acknowledges the observer, focuses on the moment when sustained perception produces response, the narrative is careful to distinguish imagination from interaction, emphasizing that imagination does not adapt, retreat, or react. When the Watchers are perceived consistently, their defining characteristic is movement in response to awareness. They are not described as solid beings, but as distortions within space, like heat ripples or shadows that possess intention rather than mass. The moment observation stabilizes, the relationship changes. The watchers shift position, withdraw into darker areas, or attempt to reassert influence by provoking emotional spikes. This reaction is the confirmation the chosen were taught to look for. Power, the chapter explains, depends on operating unnoticed. Once visibility occurs, manipulation becomes inefficient. Emotional harvesting collapses because awareness converts reaction into information. Fear, anger, and despair lose their automatic quality when they are observed in real time. The narrative explains that the watchers do not fight observation, they evade it. They rely on distraction, fatigue, and emotional overload to restore invisibility. This is why modern life, saturated with noise and constant stimulation, serves their function so effectively. The chapter highlights that observation does not require confrontation, ritual, or authority. Simply remaining present dissolves the dynamic. Jesus' teaching reframed spiritual warfare not as battle, but as clarity. The watchers cannot remain where attention is stable, calm, and sustained. Their influence requires the observer to forget themselves. When awareness holds, their role ends. The chapter concludes by reinforcing that visibility is not an attack, but an exposure. An exposure removes necessity. Visibility, as the return of human responsibility, concludes the narrative by grounding the teaching in a traditional understanding of order and responsibility. Jesus' revelation is framed not as rebellion against creation, but as restoration of balance. When perception expands, the human being no longer reacts blindly. Thoughts slow, emotions become signals rather than commands, and behavior regains deliberateness. The chosen are not depicted as rescuers of others, because visibility cannot be imposed. Each person must reclaim perception individually. The chapter explains that once the unseen is recognized, the desire to externalize blame dissolves. Influence can no longer hide behind ignorance. This is why the teaching was considered dangerous. It produced adults rather than dependents. The narrative emphasizes that nothing supernatural is introduced. There is no summoning, no invocation, no alteration of reality. The veil lifts only because attention changes. What depended on secrecy loses function and fades from relevance. The world itself does not change, the observer does. The chapter closes by affirming that this discipline aligns with ancient values of vigilance, sobriety, and self-mastery. Visibility restores the natural hierarchy where awareness governs impulse. In that state, the watchers become unnecessary, and what was once feared becomes irrelevant. If this teaching resonates, comment "I see now," subscribe for deeper revelations, like this video to reach others, and return daily as the hidden becomes visible through disciplined awareness.